Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's first session with Simon Hall from Blackmagic. Simon, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Not a problem.
How are you doing today?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, all good. Ready for a busy rest of the day. Excited for what we've got planned this afternoon. So yeah, I guess just intro yourself and we'll get cracking, mate. Thank you again.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. Hi guys. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, I can't see you all. My name's Simon. I'm a product specialist. I'm part of a technical sales team at Blackmagic, and my speciality is around post. I've been in the industry about 15 years, and I started out as sort of a runner, an offline editor to an online editor. I was a smoke operator for a while. I then worked for a company called So Editors in London for 7 years, and I was then recruited by Blackmagic. So Editors loaned me to Blackmagic for IBC about 6 years ago now. And Blackmagic poached me, and I've been with them ever since. And yeah, my primary role is I look after the post for Blackmagic. So I do a lot of work around Resolve, Fusion, our Cintel film scanner devices. So today, we kind of want to take you through sort of using Resolve remotely, and that was an interesting thing because when I approached this subject, a lot of people had asked questions about using Resolve remotely, and I kind of thought, well, what does that mean? Does it mean you're just kind of doing remote grading in Resolve, which is possible? Or is it the fact that because of the changing landscape of our world at the moment, a lot of people are at home, like I am, in my back bedroom on a machine that's possibly not as powerful as the one I'm used to using at work? And so what I wanted to do is sort of take you through everything from sort of maybe, if you're using a lower powered machine, working around issues that you may have when using, large resolution RAW files. If you're speccing up a new machine, what are the things to look for in Resolve? But then also take you through, some of the workarounds in Resolve, how you can work around things like resolution, how you can do things like optimizing media, how you can do proxy workflows, and then also how you can share projects with people, how you can share edits, how you can share grades. And then finally, taking a look at our collaboration. So, if you do have the ability to sort of set up a VPN, how, two people working remotely can collaborate on the same project at the same time. So starting at the very beginning is, at the moment you may be at home, you may be, working on a laptop, you may be considering going, look, who knows what's going to happen with the world? We may be working sort of remotely for a lot longer. So you may be looking at potentially upgrading your machine, swapping it for a new one. You may be on a laptop that needs updating. And one of the common questions I get asked all the time when working with Resolve is, what system do I need? And that all depends on what you are trying to do and the material that you're using. So there are things to bear in mind when you are looking at a system. And the thing to bear in mind is how Resolve uses its resources and what it uses them for. So when you look at a hardware setup, there are kind of 4 areas to consider. You have the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, and the storage. Now, the CPU in Resolve, it handles the encoding and decoding of compressed files. So if you use things like H.264, H.265, what you may want to do is consider a machine that has a sizable CPU, because all that sort of encoding and decoding is done via the CPU. Because again, what a lot of people do with Resolve is they spec up a big GPU and then leave everything slightly smaller. But it depends on the material you're using. Also, if you use things like raw debayering, so if you use image sequences in RAW, things like Cinema DNG, that debayer process, that taking of sensor data and applying a color profile to it through a Bayer pattern, that's done by the CPU. There's other things like non-GPU processing in Fusion, so some effects still hang off the CPU. And then obviously you've got your normal standard computer processors on top. So what I always say to people is, especially if you're using things like 4K and 6K H.265 files, consider the size of your GPU and the amount of processors it's got on it. Now, moving on from that, you've got the GPU. Now, GPU is really important in Resolve because a lot of the Resolve processes are done, the processing is done in the GPU. So, you know, all the grades, the effects, that's all GPU processing. Also, non-GOP rendering. So if you are rendering out to a non-compressed format, the GPU does the rendering. And also with newer RAW formats, so like our own, our Blackmagic RAW, because our camera does some in-camera processing, we don't have an image sequence. You end up with what is a .b-raw, a .blackmagic RAW file. And that debye process, because some of the processing is done in camera, it can actually, the processing can go through the GPU. Now, when it comes to RAM, Resolve doesn't use a huge amount of RAM. However, if you are doing Fusion, because it caches everything into the RAM for real-time playback, if you're going to be using Fusion quite a bit, you need to consider the amount of RAM you put in. And then the final thing, and it's kind of a weird thing, a lot of people do forget about the storage. So your storage, always consider not only the size, you know, have you got enough to store your rushes, but also the speed and how it connects. Because one of the things we do often find with Resolve is people are reporting problems like it's dropping frames and the audio kind of pops and bangs. And more often than not, it's down to the speed of the storage. The drive just isn't able to read the files quickly enough, and therefore it drops frames. And therefore that's when you get stuttered playback, audio that sort of pops and bangs. So these are things to consider. So, you know, when you're looking at a system, consider the majority of material that you use and look at maybe speccing a system up around that. Now, the minimum spec we say for Resolve is you need a 64-bit operating system, a minimum of 8 gig of RAM, but we recommend 16, a GPU with a minimum 2 gigabytes of VRAM. The GPU must support OpenCL 1.2 or CUDA 3.0, and obviously CUDA if you're using NVIDIA cards. And again, Metal, we support Metal in Resolve as well. And we recommend a modern quad-core CPU or higher. So that's sort of the base level, but then you can build it up from there. But then it kind of throws into the question, what if you can't? You know, if you're on a budget or you have, you know, you've got a laptop, you know, I do at the moment, I've got a MacBook Pro, I've got a laptop at the moment. What happens if I need to kind of work around these problems? So, you know, I'm using high resolution RAW files and I've just got sort of this minimum spec of machine. How can I work with those files? And this is where we come into Resolve and what it can do. So I'm just going to come out of my keynote a second, and I'm just going to drop into Resolve. So this is my material in Resolve. So these files are very nice files taken from an Aston Martin promo. And as you can see, my metadata tab in the top right-hand corner, they are Blackmagic RAW 4K files. Now, when working on a machine that you want to save processing on, there's several things you can do. And the first one is the resolution you work with. Now, this sounds a little bit weird, but stay with me on this. Again, I get a lot of people asking me going, oh, well, you know, I'm setting up Resolve, I'm using a 4K timeline. And my first question is always, do you need to work in 4K? And people often assume is to go, yeah, because my files are 4K, I don't want to lose any resolution. But that's not how Resolve works. Because what you can do in Resolve, I'm just going to jump through into my edit page, and here's an edit I've just put together using this material. At the moment, my timeline resolution is set to 720p. And what that means is Resolve is only processing an image that is 720. So as you can see, it's totally fluid in Resolve. There's no dropping frames. Everything scrubs backwards and forwards. Dead easy. Now, basically what you're doing here, because you are looking at an image that is lower resolution, you're easing the strain on the GPU. You're easing the strain of what it's got to look at. Now, people obviously get quite concerned about this because you're sort of going, well, I'm working on 720p, and what Resolve does by default is it scales all the files down to match your timeline resolution. As a default, what it does is it scales down to match your timeline resolution. So now it's scaled all the images down to 720p. And a lot of people are then concerned by going, well, I'm now working at 720p. If I up-res, won't I be up-resing to, I'm up-resing from 720p to something bigger. But Resolve doesn't work like that. It's always looking at the original material. And this is why I said, for me, it's a great feature because, dare I say, is in other editing applications, you have to set the resolution of your sequence. If you change that resolution, quite often what happens is you need to re-render. But because Resolve is always looking at the original material, if I decide that I want to change this to 1080, I can just change it. And as you can see that little flash, and it just simply rescales everything. Now, a lot of people say, well, what about if I do things like tracking? I go into the color page and I do some tracking on a 720p timeline. So I'm just going to drop this back down to 720p. And I jump across into the color page and tell you what, let me just load in a completed grade in here. So this is an example. This is a prime example. So as you can see with this, I've just highlighted the rear light here and I've done some tracking on it. So now when I play that back, yep, got my tracking on there, works perfectly fine. Now, the theory is if I were to change the resolution, say to Ultra HD, say I finally want to start to work in Ultra HD because this is what I'm going to deliver to, if I swap the timeline resolution, the tracking information stays where it is. But can you now see Resolve? Because I've got quite a few grades on here. I've got some sharpening. I've got some secondary correction. Resolve is now struggling to play this back. I'm getting about 12 frames a second. But I changed the timeline resolution back to 720. Real-time playback. But my tracking remains exactly the same. So when you do things in the color page, you said like tracking power windows, you don't have to be concerned when changing resolution. The only time you've got to bear in mind changing resolution is when you actually change the sizing in the edit page. So for example, in here, these two clips on the timeline. Let me just go back to my edit timeline without any grades on. So basically this second clip here, what I want to do is I want to match it to the position of the toy car in this shot. So I'm going to get a nice edit between the two. Now, for this, say for example, I'm going to work at HD, just so we can see this. I'm going to go back into my project settings and we're going to change this, and actually we're going to deliver to 1080p. So I'm going to change the timeline resolution. But now, obviously, what I need to do is I need to scale up this image. So what I can actually do is if I go into the retime and scaling, because I'm working in, I'm actually working on an image that is 4K, I don't want to scale this up. What I want to do is go into my retime and scaling, and in my scaling, I'm going to choose crop. And what crop will do is it will basically make your image the original resolution and crop it out to match the timeline resolution. So now I'm looking at a 4K image, but obviously it's scaled in because I'm looking at a 1080 timeline. So for this, what I can now do is, if I just sort of drop the opacity a wee bit here, again, if I've got my sort of zoom, oops, let me just reposition this. So again, because I'm working on the original image, I can go in and sort of maybe just reposition these. And again, I can zoom this in a little bit. And there we go. So now in my 1080 timeline, That's kind of a nice edit. But if I change the timeline resolution again, back to something like 720, you can now see the scaling doesn't match. So my recommendation for this is, if you are potentially, you're going to work in 720p just to ease the strain on your machine, is duplicate the clip, change the sizing of it for 1080, and then simply turn it off. So, again, I could go into this, duplicate the clip, turn that video track off. So I'll just disable that video track and now reset the transform to what it was and scale that back down again. Oops, it's got a flip on it. So now in my edit, I can continue to work on that clip in 720p, but then I know if I'm going to deliver to 1080, I still have the correctly scaled shot in my timeline. So that's the first thing, is don't sort of get hung up on resolution. You can always toggle between resolution. And then people often say, well, what happens if I've got a 4K monitor? I've got a 4K monitor for output. How can I monitor in 4K and work in 720p? Well, in your project settings, you can actually scale the image back up. So in the output scaling, if you uncheck match timeline settings, go into customize, and then I can say, well, actually, I want to make it 3840 by 2160 and save that. It will scale up the output. But again, the common misconception of that is you're scaling up 720p to be 4K. But that's not how resolve sizing works. This is why we've got many different versions of sizing. So because you can scale down for the timeline, and the scale up is always looking at the original material. So when you scale the image back up, you're looking at the 4K files, and therefore you're not going to lose any resolution on output. So that's the first thing. Don't get too hung about resolution. Now, if you find that dropping resolution still doesn't help you, you can start to do things like optimizing your media. So optimizing media in Resolve is simply a way of creating proxy files within the system. It's quite straightforward. You can simply sort of right-click on a file and say, generate optimized media, and it creates a proxy. The settings for these, again, you'll find in your project settings under the master settings. You can see under the optimized media and render cache, you can see under here, under my optimized media, I have it set to 1/8 resolution, and the optimized media format I am using is ProRes 422 proxy. So I'm using 1/8 of the resolution and a ProRes proxy file. Now, I can actually go in, and if I want to generate some optimized media, I can right click, I can say generate optimized media, and it will go away and optimize it. The process is quite fast because we don't actually wrap the files as a QuickTime file. You'll probably see if you ever go into these cache files, it looks like an image sequence. We do it like that because it makes the process faster. Now, getting between your optimized and proxy files is really, really easy. So under the playback setting menu, under here, I've got something that says use optimized media if available. So now, at the moment, I am playing this back and I'm using the optimized media. I can actually tell I'm using the optimized media because if I zoom into this shot a little bit, you can see there's some sort of quite heavy compression on here. And if I turn off the optimized media, hopefully, it should sharpen up again. There we go. So there you can see, there's my optimized media. You can see that's quite compressed. And if I turn the optimized media off, you can immediately see the image sharpen up again. But, how do you know what you've optimized and what you haven't? Again, you can get to that information within the media pool. So within the media pool, if I go into looking in the media pool in a list view, I can right click on any of these column headings, and I can actually say, show me the optimized media column. And as you can see now under my optimized media column, I've got a lot of things that say 1/8 resolution. Now, you can do one file at a time, or you can do hundreds at a time. You just got to select them all and optimize it, and Resolve will go away and optimize. Now, what it will do when you are optimizing, it will sort of tie up Resolve. You can't do anything with it. And again, a common question we get asked is, well, why can't you do this in the background? Why can't this be a background process? The one thing about background processing is, especially when, in essence, what you are doing is rendering, when you are creating proxy files like this, when you're optimizing media, you are sort of processing and rendering new files. And for, dare I say, bits of software that do have background rendering, I tend to turn it off, because what I always find is I'm fighting against the machine. And again, especially if I'm like I am at the moment, I'm just sat at home using my laptop. I find myself fighting against any background processing, so I turn it off. So this is why we've kind of kept the background processing to the forefront, or sorry, the processing of optimized media as a non-background process, because it can do it quicker, and then you're free to just carry on working. But again, if you've got a lot of files in Resolve, you've dropped a lot of files in here and you've started optimizing them, and you're not quite sure what's been optimized and what hasn't, you can always use things like smart bins to help you find optimized files. So if I add a smart bin in here, and I'll just call it optimized. So under the media pool properties, instead of choosing file name, I can scroll down to say optimize media. And as you can see, if I say optimized media is 1/8 resolution, it'll populate the smart bin. But then again, what you could do is, if you're wanting to find clips that haven't been optimized, you just change the parameter of the smart bin to say is not 1/8 resolution. I can say create a smart bin in here. And as you can see, it's dropped some sequences in, it's dropped some timelines in, but I've got a clip there that hasn't been optimized. So if I now generate the optimized media for this, it'll go away, optimize the media, and it'll disappear from the smart bin. He says it's sure to disappear from the smart bin. There we go. Just had to refresh the smart bin, because now it is optimized. So optimizing media is one way of working around, because when the optimized media is on, what you are doing is you're working with these sort of lower res proxy files, and then therefore sort of working in Resolve. Again, I'm using 720p proxy file, or 1/8 resolution, sorry, proxy files here. So as you can see, this is perfectly smooth. And it's as simple as toggling the optimized media on and off. If you wanted, you could even go in and customize a keyboard shortcut for it. So for example, with this, you can see my H key on my keyboard isn't actually assigned to anything. So if I do a search for optimized media, if I do a search for optimized in here, help if I spelt it right. I did the English spelling of it. As you can see, is use optimized media if available. I can simply say I'm going to assign the H key for that, save it. I'll save the keyboard layout as my own. And now using the H key, I can simply toggle. Quite difficult to see, but it is happening. So you can see if I zoom in here, I'm toggling the optimized media on and off. So that's a really cool proxy workflow. There's just something else to bear in mind, again, if you use optimized media. And that's when you look at Resolve color management. Because what a lot of people may do is use Resolve color management, especially if you're looking at raw files. What you may want to do is simply assign it a color space for previewing and editing. So at the moment, I'm not looking at the optimized media. So again, what I could do is go into my color management, change this to color managed. And what I can do is the input color space, I can leave it to bypass. Because these are Blackmagic raw files, the Resolve color management reads the metadata from the files. And therefore it knows the input color space, and therefore it's going to assign it an output color space. And I'm going to choose Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, and I'm going to change some simple tone mapping as well, so I don't end up clipping everything. So if I now hit save, as you can see, it's assigned the color profile. Now, however, if I say use optimize media, it keeps the color profile. So that's really cool. So, you know, if you are wanting to use color management, you can simply, you know, you can simply carry on using the color management. You know, you can simply carry on using the color management that you've assigned. Sometimes you may get strange results, something like that, for example. So that may give you a strange result there. And it's because when you're using optimized media, you're actually looking at a ProRes file. So the Resolve color management isn't quite sure what the input is. But there's a way around that. If I just go into the input color space and choose the input color space to be Blackmagic Pocket 4K Film Gen 4, because this is our 4th generation color science from the Pocket 4K camera. If I now hit save, there we go, we've got the correct profile. So that's just something bearing in mind when you're using optimized media. Now, going one further than that, again, a lot of people go, well, what happens if I don't sort of just want to use the optimized media in Resolve? What happens if you want to create proxy files? Because what you may want to do is you may want to send people proxy files. You know, if there's two of you working on a project at the same time, one of you has some raw files, what you may want to do is sort of create some QuickTimes, for example, and then send those to your colleague. They can start working on them, and then you can sort of you sort of mail out or courier out a drive with all the raw files on. So, you know, you may want to adapt a workflow where you use standalone proxy files. Now, the easiest way of creating standalone proxy files in Resolve is simply to use the media management. So these are all my raw files within Resolve here. But what I can do is just in the media management, you can simply import all your files in. And then for the entire project, I can simply say transcode all media. And as you can see, I can choose the format that I want. So for example, I can choose ProRes proxy for these. Again, I can choose a resolution. Now, the really cool thing I like about the media management is it eliminates areas where you might make a mistake. Because if you're wanting to do maybe a proxy to raw workflow, something I'm going to show you in a second, if you sort of use the deliver page in Resolve, you might end up putting extra digits in the file name. If you've accidentally done the wrong thing and you've exported a single clip rather than individual clips, time codes may mismatch. And the media management's great because all it does is say, right, everything in your project, I'm going to transcode it to what you've told me, but I'm going to keep the clip name and the time code exactly the same. So it eliminates those areas where you might make an error. And as you can see, the cool thing as well is in the media management, it tells you exactly how big your files are going to be. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to jump into a project that has these proxy files in. So this is what I made earlier. So you can see this is my same edit, but these are, I do apologize. I do apologize. I thought these were my proxy files. Just bear with me a second. They are my raw files, so just give me a second. There we go. Let me just import these in. There we go. So as you can see, I now have, this is my edit. And as you can see, I'm using these .mov files. They're ProRes proxy, they're 720p. And I can carry on using these. I'm just going to remove these two files as well, just for a second. So as you can see, these are files that I've created from within Resolve. I've built the edit. Now, if you're wanting to maybe send files, so what you can do is, you can create the proxy files within Resolve, and then you want to send them to somebody else. So maybe they can start working on an edit. You may have, maybe not in this current climate, you may have shot some extra material, or you may get extra rushes in. And what you want to do is you want to create .mov files and then send them to somebody. And this is where Resolve's Frame.io comes in. Now, we have integration of Frame.io in Resolve. What you have to do to begin with, obviously you need an account, and then in your system preferences, under internet accounts, you have to sign in to your Frame.io account in here. Once you've done that, it will load Frame.io as a media source in your media storage window. But the Frame.io integration is really, really cool, because what I can do is, I've just uploaded a couple of files in here. There we go. They'll just cache. They may appear to begin with. That they may appear as offline. It's just because they have to cache the thumbnail. But now, as you can see, I've got two files, these two proxy files in Frame.io. Now, again, the Frame.io integration in Resolve is really good, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to load up my background activity window. So what I can do is I can take these files, they're on Frame.io, I can drop them in, and as you can see, it is now downloading these files in the background. But the cool thing is I can start working on them straight away. So this is clip number 49. And as you can see, Frame.io already gives me a kind of really low res version of this file. So I can start working on it straight away. Once it's finished, you can see again, the image seems to sharpen up because now the file is actually downloaded. So that's really cool. So again, what you can do is, take a load of compressed files, send them to somebody, they can start, you can start editing before they've even downloaded. And then, if you say, well, what we'd like to do is take this project and then reconnect the raw files. So you send a drive out to them. What you can then obviously do is you can go in and simply reconnect the raw files. This is also a really cool workflow if not everybody is working in Resolve. If you are working with people who are using other editing systems, they can't access the optimized media files that Resolve has because they're only able to be read by Resolve. So creating proxy files, you could have editors working on other systems, you can have VFX guys, but then swapping out the proxy files and raw files in Resolve is really easy, which I will show you in a second, just while it's downloading. Unfortunately, this was earlier on. I'm sapping all my bandwidth because obviously I'm live streaming to you guys at the moment. So just give this a second. There we go. Right, so everything is downloaded. That's really cool. So now, in my edit, those should reconnect. Not reconnecting, not a problem. If I match frame this, it should work. Tell you what, we'll leave that for now. Sorry, they should reconnect. But as you can see, what we've done is I've downloaded these files from Frame.io, and I'm now working with the .movs. But now what I simply want to do is I want to take this media and replace it with the raw files. Now, there are a lot of ways of doing this. You can change source folders, but the easiest way is if you delete everything. If I remove everything from the project, obviously everything in the project is now offline. But what I can then do is go and find all the raw files that I had, drop those back in, and everything reconnects. So again, it will take a little bit of time at the start, but this is a surefire way again of easing the strain on your machine, but also it's a great way of sharing files, because instead of you having to upload raw files, you can generate the proxies, upload those, people can download them at the other side. And yes, Frame.io has an integration in Resolve, but you can use other systems. You can use Google Drive, Amazon, you can use things like Dropbox. So there's multiple sharing platforms out there. Obviously, Frame.io is really cool because it has an integration into Resolve. And again, I will show you a little bit more about that in a second. So that's, again, said just a little bit about how you can work with proxy files, both as optimized media and as standalone low-res proxies. Now, what happens when it comes to sharing projects? So, you've got the media, you've done an edit. What you may want to do now is you may want to share it with somebody. You may want to send them a project back. Now, obviously, the first thing you can do within a project, you can send somebody an entire project. You can simply right-click in your project manager, just do an export project, send them, and it will create a DRP file that you can just email to somebody. Also, as well, if people don't have a version of Resolve Studio, that's not a problem. If you've worked on Resolve Studio or they've worked on Resolve Studio and you only have the free version, you can open up the Studio project in the free version and vice versa. All it will do is, if you've used things that are solely available in the Studio version, so for example, things like noise reduction and certain Resolve effects, what happens when you open that project in the free version, it will simply watermark. But again, if you're just using, somebody sending you a project that you just want to tweak the edit, or you want to do, you want to tweak the grades, for example, you can do that in the free version and then send them the project back. And then when they get your free project back, when you open it in Resolve Studio, all the watermarks are simply removed. So that's something that, again, it's not something that's always well known about Resolve. It's something that's really cool, is you don't need a license to actually open a Studio version of the project. Now, what happens, though, if you don't actually want to send somebody an entire project? You just want to send them an edit. You don't want them to see some of the VFX you've been doing. You might have had a colorist in who's done some of the grading. You don't want to send them that. Maybe the project's quite big, so you just want to send them an edit. And to do that, the easiest thing to do is you can send them an XML. Also, if you are using third-party editing applications that support either XML or AAF exporting, you can simply export that from your editing software and deliver that into Resolve. Exporting from Resolve, exporting an XML is quite straightforward. You can right-click on a timeline that you've done, and as you can see in here, you've got an export XML option. You can choose where to save it, and as you can see down the bottom here, we support lots of different versions of XML. So for Final Cut 10, Final Cut 7, and Premiere, and AAF for Avid. So you can choose the format of XML, and we also accept that coming in. So for example, if somebody sent you an XML, obviously you do need the media. So what you can simply do is you can simply choose to import an XML. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to open this XML. I don't need to automatically import source clips into the media pool, because again, I'd recommend you have this turned off, because what it'll try and do is it'll try and find the original source for the files. And you may have a project, obviously, I said, is you need the media. But again, looking at what we had before, is you can send an XML to somebody that only has the proxy files, and it'll ignore the file extensions, like so. And you can therefore, if you're automatically reconnecting, you can ignore the file extensions. But again, with this, if I say or uncheck the automatically imports this in clips into the media pool, it'll simply import the XML and look for clips that are available in the media pool. So now when I do this, I'm going to choose the master bin that has everything in. I click OK. And there's our reconnect. Now, if anybody is sending you an XML, the other thing that I always recommend people to do is burn off a reference file. It can be really small. It can be like an H.264 file. But then what you've got is you've got a reference file. So you can make sure that the XML that they've sent you is exactly what they did in the software that we're using. So here I have a reference file of the edit that was sent to me. So what I can do within my source monitor, I'm going to change the input from source to offline, and then I'm simply going to drag this clip into the window, and now it's assigned that to the timeline that I have open, which is an offline reference clip. So now, as you can see, if I step through the timeline, the playheads are synced. So if I step through the timeline, I can now start to see the differences between the shots. And as you can see, I've got a little bit of a problem here because all of a sudden, my first shot, this is the reference file I'm looking at in the, sorry, this is the timeline I'm looking at in the right-hand window and the reference file in the left. So you can now see my first shot isn't correct. So what I've got to do is go in, I've got to flip that. That's fine. Don't have to worry too much about the color at the moment. So again, in here, that's the wrong way round. So again, I'd have to sort of go in and flip that. Moving further down, that all looks okay. That doesn't. So as you can see, is on the original, in the original edit, somebody had done scaling. This shot has had some scaling done on it. So now what I've got to do is I've got to try and sort of replicate that in Resolve. So I've got to try and replicate the scaling on here. Now you could try and do this by eye. So again, I could select the clip and, you know, maybe I could use my transform tool and start to go, well, you know, I've got to maybe try and match this up. But again, there are tools within the reference file that are really, really cool. So what I could do with this is actually, rather than me try and sort of match this by eye, I can simply right click in the timeline monitor and choose difference. And what the difference will do is it'll show me this sort of inverted overlay that will allow me to kind of match the file to the original. It gives me a kind of decent guide. So now what I can do is I can actually go into here, maybe start to scale this up a little bit. And I'm getting pretty close just there. Maybe scale it up just a touch more. Maybe need to tweak it a little bit. Let's just tweak that up. And maybe just so I can fine tune the position. There we go. That looks pretty good now. It's pretty similar. So again, if I do no wipe, and just fit that to the window. When I play those back together, they're almost the same. They're very, very close. So again, you know, if you've got things like speed changes, you know, this has got a speed change on here. I might have to go in and use my time mapping tools to remap. So while we try and get everything to transfer via an XML, it isn't always possible. So this is why we always recommend reference files, so you can use a reference clip to try and match. But what happens when you run into a problem such as having a mismatched clip? Now, what an XML goes on first and foremost is the time code. It uses that as a reference, and then it looks at the clip names. Now, looking at this, I've got two clips clearly with quite similar time codes. And what's happened is when Resolve's reconnected, it's reconnected the wrong file. But that's not a problem because I can use something called conform lock. So with this clip selected, I'm looking at this and to go, yep, that's the clip in my timeline. That's what it should look like. So what I can actually do is go into my clip settings and uncheck the option conform lock enable. When I turn that off, I now get, I'm just going to zoom that in a little bit and I'll just make my timeline tracks a little bit wider for you. So you can now see I have a little red icon now that's saying, okay, now you've turned off conform lock. There's something in here that's not quite right. So if I double click on that red warning, it pops up two clips. So Resolve is saying, yep, these two clips have different clip names. But first and foremost, I look at the time code. And as you can see, the start time code of the two clips is very similar. So simply Resolve's just grabbed onto the wrong one, but I can change that. So if I say, look, you should be that clip instead, I can simply change it. Now that's locked in position, I can simply go back into the clip menu, choose conform lock enable, and it locks it back down again. So that is a workflow to consider when you are simply taking edits from one system to another, or somebody, you just want to send somebody an edit, burn off an offline reference file, send them an XML, and as you can see, you can you can make sure the XML matches to everything that you did in the edit. So that's really cool as well. If they're working in Resolve, but you don't want to send them a whole project, you may not want to see, you may want to send people some of the grades you've done and some of the VFX, that's your knowledge that's gone into that. So you may not want to show everybody. So sending XMLs is, a kind of surefire way of doing that. Now, the other thing is what happens then when somebody makes changes? So you've got sent an XML, you've put all this together, you've made the changes, and then somebody goes, right, I've changed that edit now. I'm going to send you another XML of it. And what you're then sort of going is, great. What they're going to do is send me another XML, but then I've got to make all those changes that I've just made in this XML because I know things don't quite translate correctly. And okay, on a short timeline like this, it's not a problem. But if we look beyond that, if you look to say a timeline that's 90 minutes, say, or an hour, say you're doing a documentary that's an hour long, the last thing that you want to be doing is kind of having to go into a new XML that somebody's just sent you and make all those changes. But this is where Resolve's timeline comparison tool can help you out. So what I can do is I can import another XML. So for example, I've tweaked this edit, I got it how I want it, and then the editor that I've been working with comes in and goes, oh, by the way, we've changed it. So in the timelines, what I can do now is I'm just going to import another XML to say, right, here's the re-edit. You need to open that. So again, open the re-edit. I'll use the same source clips in the media pool. Okay. And there's my re-edit timeline. And there's some changes. I actually don't need the timeline open at the moment, so I'm just going to close it down. So now they've sent me a timeline through. So what I can do on the new timeline, I simply right-click, and I can say, compare with current timeline. And the current timeline is the one I have open. So if I say compare with current timeline, I'm just going to zoom, I'm just going to fit this to my window. And all of a sudden, it's comparing my original timeline with the new one. So you can now see I've got a bit of an issue here because they've inserted a new clip. They're using another clip. So the timeline, if you look at it, the timeline's actually got longer. But what you can simply do is say, well, okay, what I want to do is I want to start to make the changes that they've made. So to begin with, what I would always do is duplicate your timeline. Golden rule, whenever you edit something, if you guys edit, you will know this, is it's just one of those sort of sod's law things that if you start to re-edit an edit that you've already made, most of the time the client will turn around and go, yeah, I like the previous one you did, but you've already overwritten it. So first things first, what I would do is simply duplicate a timeline. There we go. And now what I can do on the XML that's just been sent to me, I can say do a compare with current timeline. And now I've got some, I can start to accept some changes. So as you can see in here, this green clip in here is a new clip in the timeline. So if I right click, I can simply say accept change and it drops it in. Also as well, you can see there's a slight sort of kink in this white line here, and it's because the timeline is slightly longer. So I can go in and say, well, what I'd like you to do is just accept these changes. But then weirdly, it's coming up with these sort of white markers. Everything seems to be in line. But at the moment, it's because the timeline's difference window is looking at video track 1. So if I go into my options, I can say base video track to compare. I'd like you to compare it now to V2. Oh, and all of a sudden now, we've got another clip that's been placed on V2. So I can actually say, accept the change with that. I'll accept some changes in here. Accept that change, and I need to accept that change as well. And once I've accepted the changes, as you can see, everything is then translated into the new timeline. So that's, again, it's really cool, because what it means is if somebody kind of re-edits something, you don't have to, as I said, go around and faff around with all the changes that I had to make on resizing and rescaling. I could just accept the differences between the two timelines, and now I'm working on a current timeline. If you do want to sort of send people notes with things, this is where Frame.io can really come in useful again, because I'm just going to jump back into my edit timeline in here. I might just delete that clip. Let's get rid of that a second. So this is a timeline that I've been working on, and I've uploaded it to Frame.io. So to do that, it would simply be done by the deliver page. I can dive into Frame.io. I can go and browse a folder to upload, give it a name, render it out as, say, an H.264 file. But then I'm just going to tab into my Safari a second. So this is the file in Frame.io. So again, I can double click it, open it up, and just wait for it to cache a little bit. But I can sort of step through this file, and I can say, scrolling through here, okay, that shot looks a little bit noisy. So again, I can just type a comment in here where I can say, just check noise. Check noise. There we go. So I can say, I'm leave a comment in there, and then I can scroll through a little bit more and go, I'm going to say, I'm not sure about the speed on that. So again, I can just say, I want you to check the speed on that. And if I hit send, as you can now see, it's put those two markers on here. But now what I do is if I go back into Resolve, and in Resolve, I can say, show me my Frame.io markers. There we are. So as you can see, there's my check speed, and there's the check noise. It'll automatically put one as a default at the beginning. And sorry, I've just accidentally added a fifth one. But as you can now see in here is I've got the markers. So again, they've now been updated in Frame.io. It's updated in Resolve. And now I can go in and check these. And that's a live process. But again, if you've done it on one timeline, and what you're sort of saying is, well, actually what I want to do is I want to take those markers into a different timeline. What we've actually done is, somebody sent me an XML with a new timeline. What I want to do is take these markers and apply them to my new timeline. Well, you can do that as well. If I take my edit sequence here, under timelines, I can say export timeline markers to EDL. Now, this doesn't go for Frame.io markers. It can go to all markers. So again, if you're wanting to send people markers along with an XML, you can send them an EDL. So again, I'll just call this markers. Okay. There we go. So there's my marker. So for example, this was my XML that we made the changes to. And that is XML resolve copy. So again, I can go and find that. And I can actually say, in my timelines, I can say import timeline markers from EDL. They're the markers. I can open those in, and it drops the same markers back in. So even if you want to send Frame.io markers or different markers where you want to leave comments for people, send them an XML, send them the EDL as well. And you can then just incorporate your notes into different sequences. Now, moving on from that, what happens if you've already started grading? So, you have started grading a project. So as you can see in here, I have a completed grade. Whoops, I'll just turn off my color management. There we go, that's better. So, you know, I have just started grading this content, and then somebody goes, ah, yeah, we've made changes to it. Again, what you could do is you could just copy the stills. You could just generate the stills in Resolve. So, for example, if I just go into my gallery, I'll just add a new still album. I'll just call that demo. And again, you know, what I could do is for all these stills, I can simply right click, say, grab all stills from first frame. And what it will do is it will simply generate all the stills into my library, and then I could copy those over. But again, that's kind of time consuming, because what you've got to do is you've got to find the correct clip, copy it on. And again, that takes time. And this is where color trace comes in. Because with a color trace, what I can do is let's go into the edit that we did. So this is the new edit. This was the XML that I was sent. But I've already started grading another sequence. Again, it's not a problem, because what I can do is I can use color trace, which will trace the grades from one timeline to another. So again, I right click on the timeline that I want to trace the grades to, and under timelines, oopsie, let me just try that again. Under timelines, where's my color trace option in here? Sorry guys, just give me a second. Let me try the re-edit one. There we go. So again, just as an example, let me close these down. Again, this is the, as I said, this is the re-edit. This is the same sequence. So what I can do is if I just simply right click and under timelines, said I can simply say color trace. I'm going to say color trace from timeline. Now what Resolve will do is it will open up, it will allow you to access any timeline in any project on that database. So again, you don't even have to have the same project open. But what I can do is go and find the timeline that I want to copy the grades from. That is my completed grade just there. I can hit continue. And now, as you can see, it opens up the color trace. Now, the color trace, you can either do automatic or manual. Now, manual will allow you to do one clip at a time, but automatic's really good. Where it's green, it's saying, I've got a definitive match from the clip you've graded to the clip I'm copying to. Where it's blue, it's saying, there's a bit of a timecode mismatch in here. Again, remember those two clips? I know from looking at my timeline, that is actually the right clip. Where we get orange clips, these orange icons in here, those are the new clips in the timeline. So what I can say is say copy, grade, and exit. So what I will do is copy, grade, and exit. What that should do then, there we go, it's copied all the grades to my new timeline. So again, if I go into the color page now, it's copied all the grades to my new timeline, but the clips that were added in that weren't in my original timeline that I graded don't have any grades on. So now I can go in and start to grade those. So again, you know, if you're using a color trace is great because again, you don't have to go in and regrade all your shots. You can just trace them one to the other. And again, what happens, you know, what happens if you may have done your grading in another system? Well, obviously with that, you can't sort of take a lot of information over because obviously other systems have different tools. They call them different things, but there is a system that will allow you to take basic grades across everything. And this is called a CDL, a color decision list. Now, CDLs said they can be used across multiple pieces of software, but it only contains basic information. And that basic information is simply the lift gamma gain controls and also the saturation. They're the only parameters it carries, but it's good if somebody's done kind of a base grade or a simple balance on shots. If it'll also in Resolve, if you take a CDL, it only takes the first node. So don't bother trying and doing multiple nodes and secondary corrections. That will not be contained in the CDL. So what I can do is, I'm just going to load up a master grade. Now, what we did with the CDL in this is I just dumped all the master clips into one timeline and then graded them individually. Now, you can see with this, all these clips simply have on them is a balance. The other important thing to remember if you're going to send people CDLs is the Luma mix. If you're sending somebody a CDL in Resolve, the Luma mix has to be set to 0. Because of the way Resolve uses its color in YRGB, that's sort of exclusive to Resolve. That's something that Resolve uses. So for a CDL, if you want to send a CDL to somebody else for, say, another system, you've got to make sure the Luma mix is set to 0. But, if you've done a grade, what you can actually do, so that's my master grade just here. What you can actually do is right click and you can simply say export a CDL. And again, I will call it master grade Resolve. Now, if you haven't set the Luma mix to 0, I've done that. What Resolve will do is it'll prompt you. It'll say the Luma mix isn't 0. Now, putting a CDL back into Resolve, again, you can do it from the timeline settings. So basically, it's slightly confusing, but in Resolve, the CDL is contained within an EDL. So again, my CDL timeline in here, what I can do is I can right click and under timelines, I can say import, no, sorry, it's under color trace. So I can say under color trace, I want you to color trace from CDL, and I will get that master grade that I had done. Now, again, what Resolve will now do also, it'll say, I want to find an XML as well, but you don't need to because the CDL is contained within an EDL. So if I now just cancel that, it brings up the color trace. Now, at the moment, this is slightly weird because it's saying, well, everything's orange. Now, what the CDL will do is it'll look at the real number. It looks at real names. Now, admittedly, with this project, I've been a bit slapdash and not put any real names on here. But if I then say ignore real names, all of a sudden, the CDL is saying, yep, I've got a match for everything in the timeline. So if I now say copy, grade, and exit, it has actually put those balance controls in. Now, again, so as you can now see, I've got those balance controls. Now, the advantage, as I said, the sort of the downside of using a CDL, it's very limited in the information it can carry. However, it carries across multiple different pieces of software. So if you have a piece of software that can export a CDL, you can import that into Resolve. A couple of other things as well, just to bear in mind, is if you want to limit, for example, if you just want to, you've done a color trace, and it's again you've got hundreds of clips, and it's copied all the grades apart from the clips that haven't been graded. A good way of filtering those results is using the lightbox. So in the color page, you can go into the lightbox. And actually, I can say, just go and find me ungraded clips. And therefore, I can come out of the lightbox, and now it'll limit. So again, I don't have to keep searching through hundreds of clips. If you've got a long sequence, you don't have to keep going finding clips. So again, the lightbox is really good. So you can just check what's been graded and what hasn't. Now, admittedly, the final way is especially if you're grading, if you are sending somebody simply a project to grade with, you could send them a flattened file. Because again, with that, you don't have to do XMLs. You don't have to make sure all the changes. You can just send a flattened file that you can then simply chop up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump back into my media page a second, and I'm just going to add a new bin in here. And I'll just call this scene cut. So Resolve has something in it called scene cut detection. So scene cut detection, what I can do is I can actually go and find a flattened off QuickTime file. Again, do bear in mind, if you're going to render this off, you are going to be stuck with the codec you are using. So again, if it's, you want to grade on RAW, this may not be the best workflow because you've got to flatten off the file. But, you could send something like a ProRes 422HQ or a 444. As you can see, mine's a 422HQ and it's Ultra HD. So this isn't, doing this workflow, this isn't great for editing because it'll simply splice up a clip, but you'll have no handles. So if you need to trim a clip, you have no extra material to use. So this isn't the best way of working while you're sharing projects and versions when you're editing. But when you're grading, if you've reached picture lock, if there is such a thing anymore, you can just send off the flattened file. So what I could do with this, I can simply right click and I could say scene cut detection, and I could say auto scene detect. And what Resolve will do is it will go through and it will find the cuts. Yeah, and as you can see, that's not entirely worked. Because, when there's a definitive cut, like so, when there's a definitive cut like so, again, when you're looking at scene cut detect, the important differences are the first and second window. That's the outgoing frame of the previous clip and the incoming frame of the next clip. So basically where it's put the cut point. So that works for, when you've got a straight cut. But the problem is when you've got something like a transition, so I can step through a frame at a time here, I've got a transition. So now Resolve is throwing in hundreds of cuts. So you do have this qualifying line that you can start to adjust to say, well, ignore that, don't ignore that. But again, this can get very time consuming. So again, if you were going to send a flattened off movie for somebody to cut at their end, or somebody sending you a file, get them to send you an EDL as well. And again, you can simply right click on a timeline, export EDL, because what I can do with the scene cut detect, I can say load an EDL in. I can find that EDL. I'm going to discard the changes that I made previously. And there we go. Because the EDL's put definitive cut points in, there it is. It's chopped my my clip into exact clips. It's still got transitions on, but because of the EDL, it's put the cut points exactly where they need to be. And then I can simply say, add cuts to media pool. And there it all is. And then simply, I can select all those clips and simply say, create new timeline using selected clips. Call that scene cut. Create, and there we go. And now I can start grading that. So I said it's okay for grading. I wouldn't recommend it for editing because, again, it's saying when I try and trim this, I have no handle. Obviously, I can make it shorter, but I can't make anything longer. And this is why when sharing edits, XMLs are so much better. So what we've done there is we've looked at how you can send people edits, how you can send people projects, how you can send people, oh, by the way, sorry, just before I forget, sending people grades. What happens if you want to send somebody a grade? Well, Obviously, said you can send them a CDL, you can send them an XML, but if you want to send them the exact grade that you've done, you can simply export your stills. You can simply export a still. So you simply export the still, and you can gather up all those stills and send it to them. A really cool thing about sending stills is it takes not only your grade, but it also takes the debias settings. Because, for example, if I take a look at this clip, if I sort of live preview this, that grade doesn't look right, because everything's sort of blown out. Again, I've got to come off this, but basically you can see the body width was blown out, the sky was blown out. But the cool thing about stills, they also take debias settings if they've been done on a clip-by-clip basis. So funnily enough, when I actually apply this grade, it applies the grade as it should have looked, because it's also including the debias settings as well. So if you've, for example, if you've graded files where you've debiased things on a clip-by-clip basis, grabbing the still takes that information as well, and you can send that too. So again, it's another way is if you need to send grades and have all that detail in there, you can send it. Now, as I said, this is really cool. So we've looked at, said how you can share edits, how you can share grades, if people send you edits, how you can track changes in the edit page, how you can track changes in the grading page. But I suppose there is an easier way of doing all of that, of all of this, and that is using Resolve's collaboration. Now, you can set up collaboration if you have if you can set up a VPN. So basically what has to happen is the database has to be on the same network. So if you've got a machine that can set up a VPN and somebody can remote into it, you can collaborate in a cloud-based environment. Now, setting this up is done via the Resolve project server. So within Resolve, you do have a Resolve project server within the Resolve software. And what you can do is you can set up a new database on your VPN by clicking, once you've got your VPN set up, you click set new database. You then it's at the moment, you can, let me just click on a different one. On a database, you can say enable sharing, and it will enable the sharing of the project. And then to get somebody to connect to that database, you simply send them the access key. So what you would do is you'd send them the access key. Unfortunately, this is really difficult to show you on one machine, but you'd then simply send them an access key. There it is. You could email them that. They then drag it into the database at their end, and it will remote in to the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to that now. So actually I have a database set up. I'm just going to turn off dynamic project switching because it won't allow it. So this is a project that is set up on another machine at the moment. So as you can see, somebody is already in the project because I've got this little icon here that is showing me that somebody is in that bin. Now, the first problem we've got with this is my media is offline. That's because the initial project was set up on the other system. So again, I said, unfortunately, it's really difficult to show you on one screen, but said this database is running on a different system at the moment. And basically, it is connected to the footage in the project. So what I'm saying is, on the remote machine that you can't see at the moment, the media is all connected. Because as you can see, when I click on a file, it says volumes, 480 gigabyte SSD, That's the file it's looking at. Now, what people do is they make the common mistake here of just going, oh, just reconnect these files. The problem is, if you reconnect the files at your end, at the other machine's end, the files are going to go offline because you're working on the same project. And this is where something called mapped mounting comes in Resolve, which is really clever. So what I need to do is, in my Resolve preferences, what I need to do is go into my media storage, and I'm going to add a media storage location on this system that has my files in. So again, if I just go into Documents, Aston Martin, Remote Working, raw files. So there's all the media that I'm using for this project on my system. I hit open. Obviously nothing is happening at the moment, but what I really need to do, I'm just going to save that a second because I just want to select one of these files and then go back into it. So what I need to do, you can see on here, I've now got something in the media storage called mapped mount. So what I am saying is, in Resolve, when you see the mapped mount folder location, go to this folder instead. So the mapped mount is volumes, 480 gigabyte SSD, AM, raw files. So again, if I just double click in the mapped mount and I type in the actual media path, so I call this volumes /480 gigabyte SSD, Aston Martin, raw files. No, make that a /. There we go. So as you can see, that matches where the original files on the other system are. So if I now save that, what I do have to do is to refresh this because I've changed the preference. I've got to quit Resolve. Quit Resolve, and I'm then just going to reopen it. Did it? Just bear with me a second. It's slightly slower at loading because, funnily enough, I've set this up. It's actually using my Wi-Fi at the moment, so this project may be slightly slower to open up. But now, when I double click into this, there's the media online. So I've not changed this. So on my other machine, this is online as well. So that's how you get around the fact that if you are collaborating on a project on a VPN, but you both have copies of the media, if you can't save them in the same place, use the mapped mount, and it will allow you to say, okay, when you're looking at this media path, look at this media path instead. And that is what has happened here. Now, again, in the collaboration, you guys may not have seen this before. What can happen is, what I'm going to do is I am on my other machine. At the moment, guys, I am driving another machine at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the hold bin. So what I am going to do here, guys, is on my other system at the moment, I am going to make some changes. So unfortunately, I said it's really difficult to see because I'm using two displays, but I'll just kind of, on my system at the moment, trust me, I've made some changes to the edit timeline. Now, as you can see, I'm just going to go into the edit page. In the timelines bin now, there is now a refresh symbol on here. So now I go in, let me just come out of this on my other machine. So basically what happened was I double clicked, and it's really difficult to see, but trust me, it has applied the changes to the timeline as live. Tell you what, probably easier to do this is I'll show you in the color page. So what can happen, we're both in the edit timeline on the color page. Sorry guys, my remote system is just refreshing its stills gallery. Just give me a second. So yeah, you know, working remotely, so this gets around it. So you can work on the same project at the same time. You can send each other comments. So when you're editing in the edit page, whoever takes control of a bin takes control of everything within that bin. So you do need to get kind of wise as to how to set things up. So for example, if you've got different clips for different timelines, you'd put the timeline and the clips in their own individual bin, and then yeah, you sort of put them in the own bin and then take control over it. So now can you see at the moment in the color window, when you're working in the color window, you can have graders working on the same project at the same time. So as you can see here at the moment, my remote system is using clip number 12. So let's just do a quick grade on that on my remote system that you guys unfortunately can't see. I'll just do a quick grade on that. There we go. And then from my remote system, what I'm going to do is send a message. So I can say, so as you can now see in the Resolve interface, I've got a message in here. It's sent me through clip number 12. If the colorist who's worked on that clip then moves to another clip, you can now see I've got a refresh symbol. If I click on the refresh symbol, it applies the grade. So with collaboration, you can have separate media. You just need to change the map mount, but then you can edit, you can grade, you can do VFX, all in the same project at the same time. So you don't have to send XMLs and EDLs and color decisions and lists. You can just work together in one project. So hopefully that takes you through a little bit kind of about what I thought working remotely with Resolve is. You know, the working on the lower spec machines, the you know, having to work around maybe certain issues that you may have if you're just working from home remotely with a laptop. You can use optimized media, you can use proxy media. How do you share your edits with people? You know, you can send XMLs, you can send entire projects. As I said, is you can download the free version of Resolve if they don't have it to open your project. You can send grades. You can take grades that you've done and trace them to other timelines that people have sent you. But then also said, if you have the ability to sort of set up a VPN, you can collaborate across using the same project at the same time, but using two separate bits of media. The final thing, and thanks for sticking with me for so long with this, is the final thing is maybe just what else you might want to consider for working. So for example, we have Ultra Studio and DeckLink devices to get a sort of clean video output from your machine. Yes, you can use full screen GUI, but if you want kind of to have a properly accurate color output, we recommend an Ultra Studio or a DeckLink device. So Ultra Studio, if you're using sort of a sealed system like a Mac, and DeckLink if you have a PC tower, they are sort of the minimum, sort of these are the boxes that sort of do the minimum these are the minimum spec of boxes that you need to do something like 1080p 30. You can do it on an Ultra Studio mini monitor. On DeckLink, we do a DeckLink mini monitor. If you want to go up to 2160p at 30 for monitoring, for the Ultra Studio, you need an Ultra Studio 4K mini. For a DeckLink, we do a mini monitor 4K. And then if you want to do 2160p 60, you know, if you've got an output monitor that does that, we do have an Ultra Studio 4K mini. But then the DeckLink, you've got to go up and use the Extreme 12G. If you want to do 8K, if you do have an 8K screen, at the moment we don't have an Ultra Studio device. The only thing we've got is an 8K Pro, and for that it is SDI only. For HDR, if you're looking at doing HDR, these are the only devices that we recommend or are capable of doing a proper HDR workflow. So your Ultra Studio Mini Monitor, Ultra Studio 4K Mini, Ultra Studio 4K Extreme, and your DeckLink 4K Extreme 12G and 8K Pro. And bearing in mind the 8K Pro is SDI only. Other bits of kit that potentially you might want to consider that Blackmagic do, things like web presenters, mini and micro converters, or A10 Mini or A10 Mini Pro panel, or Hyperdeck, especially in this current climate when you're working remotely. So that, for example, is a setup of using Resolve, and you want an output to a grading monitor. You might then want to see how it looks on a domestic TV. But what you also might want to do is send your output just for the client to review it. So as you can see, you can have an Ultra Studio 4K Mini. You can send an HDMI out to the grading monitor. You can then send an SDI out, convert it to HDMI and send that into your TV. And then for a live stream, you could go SDI out of your Ultra Studio 4K Mini and into a web presenter that a client could review. You know, if, for example, you're doing like what a lot of people are doing now, you want to do sort of webinars and training, you could look at a setup like this using the A10 Mini Pro, in the fact that you could take a Resolve output, so you could take the GUI output of Resolve, you could have an Ultra Studio 4K Mini, which will give you your Resolve output. You could then take maybe one of our pocket cameras that will film you as a presenter, and then a Hyperdeck Mini, so maybe you've recorded, you know, you've got some pre-recorded video, so you've got a little intro to your webinar. You could play that back on a Hyperdeck, and you could pipe all those into the A10 Mini and then simply live switch between them. So there's just some other bits of hardware, you know, to consider if you are maybe wanting to do client reviews from home, you're wanting to do sort of more polished looking webinars. We have sort of the infrastructure that goes around that. Wow. And that's pretty much all I have to say, guys. I mean, thank you very much for listening to me for this amount of time. I know, Jake, we're kind of out of time, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah, we've only got 2 minutes left of the hour and a half. You really did steam through that. Like, so there's a lot of information in that in such a short, such a short period of time. That's good though.
The one thing for the guys that are in the seminar at the moment, can I post a message?
Yes.
I can post my email address.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Jay. Can I post it in the seminar questions?
Yeah. So if you just click in on the seminar questions, you can just pop it in there, mate. Because there is there's a lot of questions, a lot from Marcus in Discord. So yeah, it may be worth you guys having a chat, because there's a lot. I mean, to be honest with you, there's enough questions there for another hour and a half easy. So so yeah, not enough time to go through them all. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah, put them in the Discord, and then on the YouTube afterwards there'll be there'll be a few questions on there, so you guys can have a look at them.
Okay. I tell you what, rather than me put my web address, there's going to be a lot of questions. What I will do is I will put the Blackmagic pre-sales email address in.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
There we go. So there we go. So if the guys have questions, just ping some questions into that. There's both myself and Paul, my colleague, and a couple of other guys will be able to jump all over that. So yeah, sorry I took up the whole hour and a half. For anybody who's still there, thank you for listening, guys. Said we covered a lot there, and again, I've seen some of you do have some more detailed questions. Yeah, some of you have a more kind of detailed questions. So yeah, I will come and address those.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.